Welcome to episode 2 of Unqualified with Republic Defender 78. I suppose that's me. The first episode garnered about 10 views, and I'm ready to build on that. While I would love to start things off with some type of witty monologue, I'm going to spare you. Witty monologues require charisma and humor, and I clearly lack those things. Instead, I'm going to force you to endure the first episode available now on YouTube to see me hastily provide my credentials. To save you the trouble, I have none. Yes, I realize that's in the title. To start things off, I'd like to talk to you about a story you may not have heard concerning ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. Currently, there is an ongoing effort to make American citizens aware of what is happening with ICE being weaponized by our Cheeto-dusted dictator Donald Trump and his chief ghoul Stephen Miller. While the names Alex Preddy and Renee Good have become commonly known, many have struggled to keep Keith Porter Jr. and many others listed amongst those tragically lost since this nightmare began. We have seen numerous accounts of poorly trained ICE agents showing a high priority for antagonizing and harassing observers. A report filed by Yahoo News from the Associated Press on February 20th states that there was a DHS-involved shooting that bears astounding similarities to what we all saw on the news thanks to the observers in Minnesota. Ruben Ray Martinez had just turned 23, and what happened to him is why I have come around to understand why it's so important to take out your phone and record what you see when you see it. If not for the actions of American Oversight, a nonprofit watchdog group based in Washington, D.C., who obtained this information through a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, we may not have ever known about this. Also, when you consider the timing, DHS and ICE not only had a game plan for covering up their actions, they had an example of having done so. On the night in question, Martinez and his friend were heading to San Antonio to celebrate his 23rd birthday with South Padre Island in mind. According to his mother, his state of mind was set on celebration. He never really got a chance to go out and experience things. It was his first time out of town. He was a nice guy, a humble guy, and he wasn't a violent person at all. Again, it's important to shout out to the people on the ground all over the country, showing the rest of the world what's going on. And it makes it extremely hard for Stephen Miller to control the narrative. If it weren't for all those cameras there for Alex Preddy and Renee Good, they would have lied to us. Heck, they did lie to us, despite the cameras. According to the heavily redacted report provided by DHS, agents surrounded the vehicle, telling those inside to get out, but the driver accelerated forward and struck an HSI special agent who wound up on the hood of the vehicle. Remember when I showed you 2 different FBI agents that made it clear that it was against policy to block a vehicle with your body? An HSI supervisory special agent standing by the side of the car then fired his weapon multiple times through the open driver's side window, and the vehicle stopped. What does that sound like to you? This took place on March 15th, 2025. Let's paint a picture. Border Patrol agent Charles Exum opened fire on Miramar Martinez in Chicago on October 4th, 2025. He, Charles Exum, is infamous for 2 things: chronic halitosis and stating, "I fired 5 rounds and she had 7 holes." Put that in your book, boys. What book? They say that message to his friends and family. I don't know about you, but I always address Big Mama and all the aunties as boys, especially at Christmas. We already saw the White House lie to us when Donald Rumsfeld talked about yellow cake. Excuse me, sorry. What makes this worse is now we have footage from instant replay level angles, and the White House still lied in the now. You really think that ICE agents weren't aware of what happened in March almost a year prior? You think he hadn't seen that book he was referring to? As an unqualified American, I am wrong my fair share of the time. I will say I promise to never run for office and admit when I say something not quite accurate. Or if my take is off and I'm still not sold on ground news, we'll see. But I wasn't sold on whipping out our phones, and now I am. Ruben Ray Martinez looks to have been a blueprint for how they would silence any and all dissent. Activism and exposure, citizen journalism has effectively foiled that plan. Remember, we're only talking about citizens that we know about for sure, but there are many others who have suffered and even died in ICE custody. It's looking more and more like a good way to stop what ICE is doing is making sure Ruben Ray Martinez is not a story you haven't heard of. Hey gang, we are about to send Republic Defender and Debate Sensei down to the planet below to pick up the data pack we're going to use to talk about the corporate lobby. So hang in there and check out this next segment. Apologies for the audio. We had to do some reconstructing of the footage, but that's pretty much how it went. Thanks. Okay, we had to edit some of this footage. We are making our way down to the planet to retrieve a black box that actually has some information for real Earth. Nova was, as always, difficult to work with, but we did our best. Ouch. Okay, Nova, can you define political lobbying so we're all on the same page?
Absolutely. Political lobbying is the act of individuals, groups, or organizations attempting to influence public policy or decision makers, typically by directly engaging with legislators or government officials. It's a way for stakeholders to present their interests, provide expertise, and push for specific outcomes in the legislative process.
This entire lobbying practice, is it legal?
Yes, absolutely. Lobbying is legal in the US and many other countries, as long as it's done transparently and registered properly. Lobbyists often have to disclose their activities, financial backing, and the issues they're working on, ensuring a level of accountability.
I see the package. By the way, how does lobbying benefit everyday Americans?
That's a great point. Lobbying can actually help everyday Americans by giving them a voice in the political process. It allows citizens, consumer groups, and smaller organizations to amplify their concerns, ensuring that their needs might be considered alongside big corporate interests.
Okay, we're on our way back to the ship. Last question. Can lobbying be used to take advantage of American laws?
Yes, it definitely can be. While lobbying itself is a legal practice, it can be exploited if it involves undue influence, secretive financial backing, or pushing policies that primarily benefit a narrow few at the expense of the public. So it's really about how it's done and the transparency behind it.
Okay, thanks, Nova. We're heading back up to the ship now. We'll see you then. Now that we're safe on top of the Pelican, we'll get in there and defrag this data on this black box. Hopefully, Super Earth didn't notice we were down there. Now that the guys are back on ship and getting cleaned up, I'm going to sit down with Nova and go through all this data. Hang in there. Thanks for watching.
Just give me a shout and we'll fine tune it.
Sure thing. Okay, so we are at the point where we're going to unpack all the data we picked up about political lobbying.
Got it. So we're diving deep into lobbying data. Whether it's trends, key players, or historical shifts, let's break it down step by step. What aspect do you want to start with?
Let's get some basic key terms established again. So let's establish the history of the term, where the term lobbying come from.
The term lobbying actually comes from the physical lobbies of legislative buildings, literally where advocates would wait to catch legislators. One popular origin story involves the Willard Hotel's lobby in Washington, D.C., where people tried to meet President Ulysses S. Grant. Over time, it grew to mean influencing lawmakers anywhere.
Is there a particular point in U.S. history when it became official?
A defining moment was the 1946 Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act. That was the first major U.S. law that required lobbyists to register and disclose their activities when attempting to influence legislation. So that really marked when lobbying became officially regulated and acknowledged as a formal practice.
All righty. Let's see here. How about... So, what are the various types of lobbying?
In broad strokes, you've got direct lobbying, where lobbyists communicate straight to lawmakers. Then there's grassroots lobbying, which is when the public is mobilized to influence officials. Corporate or business lobbying involves companies advocating for their interests. Trade associations lobby on behalf of industries, and public interest lobbying is done by groups advocating for broader societal causes like the environment or human rights.
If there were a pie chart of the most powerful lobbies, who would be the most powerful lobby groups in America?
Right now, some of the most powerful lobbying groups in the U.S. include AIPAC, which has been heavily involved in primaries, the National Association of Realtors, which spent tens of millions, the AI and tech industry, which is ramping up influence heading into the 2026 midterms, and big banks, which increased their lobbying spending recently due to fintech and crypto concerns. All of these groups are positioning themselves to shape upcoming policy and elections.
And in what ways do these groups affect legislation?
They influence legislation through a few core tactics. They fund extensive lobbying teams who directly meet with lawmakers, helping draft or amend bills. They donate to political campaigns or PACs, building goodwill. They run public campaigns, ads, grassroots mobilization to sway public opinion. They might offer expert testimony or research to committees. In short, they make sure their voices and interests are front and center when laws are being shaped.
Now, when we talk about a representative democracy, how does corporate lobbying factor in to a representative democracy when legislation is designed to benefit individual citizens?
Ideally, in a representative democracy, legislation reflects the needs of citizens. But corporate lobbying can tilt that balance. Corporations have resources to amplify their voices, whether via direct lobbying or campaign contributions, sometimes prioritizing business interests, which might not always align with broader public interests. The result? Sometimes policies get shaped with a stronger corporate slant. It's why transparency and balanced representation remain key.
What forms of legislation exist to maintain transparency?
To keep things transparent, we've got laws like the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which requires lobbyists to register and report their activities. The Federal Election Campaign Act and its amendments regulate political contributions, so we know who's funding campaigns. More recently, the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act tightened reporting requirements and extended cooling off periods. These ensure we have a clearer picture of who's trying to influence lawmakers and how.
Is there any way to quantify how successful these laws are in terms of regulating corporate lobbying and its influence?
It's tough to put an exact number on success because influence is nuanced. However, we can track things like how many lobbyists are registered, how much they spend, and who they meet. Disclosure laws have improved transparency. Now we know more about who's lobbying. But measuring how much policies are swayed by lobbyists is complex, since influence might be indirect or cumulative. Still, watchdog groups and public scrutiny have made it harder to operate entirely in the shadows.
What was the last legislative victories that watchdog groups gained in terms of curtailing improper corporate lobbying?
Recently, watchdog groups saw a victory when Vermont passed a strict data privacy law in 2024, allowing residents to sue companies over data misuse, despite heavy tech lobbying. Meanwhile, in 2026, Verizon successfully lobbied to avoid tougher cybersecurity rules in New York after spending about $1 million on lobbying. These examples show how public interest groups and corporate lobbyists continue to shape regulations, sometimes in opposite directions.
Is it possible to have grassroots lobbying without corporate lobbying?
Absolutely. Grassroots lobbying is often driven by ordinary people or community groups, not corporations. You see it when citizens rally around issues like civil rights, environmental protection, or healthcare. These movements rely on public awareness, petitions, rallies, and direct contact with representatives, completely independent from corporate funding or influence.
While we're talking to everyday Americans about the issues that matter to them the most, I kept thinking that when it comes to lobbying, we have a couple of major sectors like the housing market, healthcare, and education. So let's run down the list. When it comes to the housing market, who is or what is the most powerful lobby?
The most powerful housing lobby in the US is the National Association of Realtors, representing around 1.5 million real estate professionals. In 2024, they spent more on lobbying than any other group, advocating on issues like mortgage regulations and homeownership tax credits. Other influential housing groups include the National Multifamily Housing Council and the National Association of Home Builders.
Of those ones that you listed, are all of those groups representing realtors and other private organizations?
Yes, those groups represent private industry interests. The National Association of Realtors advocates for realtors and property owners. The National Multifamily Housing Council focuses on the apartment and rental housing industry. And the National Association of Home Builders represents home construction companies. Each works to influence policy in favor of their respective sectors.
Are there any major policies you can show us that they've championed in the last 10 years?
In the past decade, the National Association of Realtors has pushed for policies to expand housing supply, preserve real estate agents' independent contractor status, and maintain tax benefits like mortgage interest deductions. They backed the VA Home Loan Reform Act to protect veterans' home buying rights. In 2024, they also settled a major lawsuit on real estate commissions, ending mandatory buyer agent fees and listings.
Is there a commission that would rate whether or not a particular organization favors private citizens versus private organizations?
There isn't a formal government commission that rates whether organizations lean toward private citizens or private companies. However, watchdog groups like the Center for Responsive Politics, now Open Secrets, or the Sunlight Foundation track lobbying spending and influence. They analyze data to show whether policies benefit the public or specific industries. So while there's no official rating, public interest groups help shine a light on those leanings.
I ask that because it seems like the National Association of Realtors has some things that would benefit homeowners in terms of regulating mortgage rates. Or are the rates they are setting not typically beneficial to lower income prospective buyers?
It's a mixed bag. The National Association of Realtors often advocates for things like mortgage interest deductions, which can benefit homeowners. But those policies often help middle or higher income homeowners more. When they oppose things like changes to agent commissions, it's often to protect their business model. So while some of their policies might support homeownership broadly, they can sometimes leave lower income buyers behind.
When we talk about organizations that are buying up properties and making an impact on the price of the housing market, are these organizations under the umbrella of the National Association of Realtors, or are there other lobbyist groups that cover those organizations as well?
Institutional investors like large private equity firms or hedge funds aren't under the National Association of Realtors. They're separate players. Groups like the Real Estate Roundtable or the National Multifamily Housing Council often represent those larger entities. These big buyers do influence housing markets, often buying up single-family homes for rentals, which can drive up prices. So yes, there are other lobbying groups that advocate on behalf of large investors, separate from the realtor-focused lobbying.
In terms of legislation, is there any overlap in the bills that they're championing?
There's definitely overlap in some areas. Both realtors and large investors might back policies that expand housing supply or streamline zoning, but they diverge on consumer protections. Realtors might champion tax breaks for homeowners. Institutional investors often focus on deregulation to ease large-scale property purchases. So while they sometimes align on broad real estate growth, their priorities often split when it comes to protecting average home buyers.
Do me a favor before we move on to the next section. Can you post a list of your source sites so I can more easily drop them into YouTube when the time is right?
Open Secrets Lobbying Database is a key resource for tracking lobbying activities in the U.S. It shows how much companies or associations spend, who they lobby, and which issues they influence. You can track trends like the rise in tech and AI lobbying, and link lobbying spending to legislative outcomes. This can help you build a clearer picture of who's influencing policy and how.
Is that a one-stop shop, or does Open Secrets link to other sources?
Open Secrets is a pretty comprehensive hub for lobbying data. but it often references data from official sources like the U.S. Senate's Lobbying Disclosure Act database or the Federal Election Commission for campaign finance. For deeper policy specifics, you'd look at congressional records or think tank reports. But for a broad, centralized picture of lobbying influence, Open Secrets is a great starting point.
Understood. Before we move on to, are there any grassroots counters? Are there any grassroots lobbying firms who work in this same arena, who are on the other side of these same legislative fights?
Yes, absolutely. On the housing front, you'll see groups like the National Low Income Housing Coalition or the Homes Guarantee Campaign. They advocate for affordable housing, tenant protections, and curbing large investor dominance. In the broader economic sphere, groups like Public Citizen or Americans for Financial Reform push back on corporate interests. They use grassroots mobilization to press for policies that prioritize average citizens over big business.
Can you show me a link we can use in case people want to support them?
If anyone wants to support the National Low Income Housing Coalition, you can visit their official website at nlihc.org. They're one of the key grassroots organizations advocating for affordable housing and renter protections.
Your font is still so small. I'm gonna try to make your font bigger.
Haha, no worries. When we drop it in a YouTube description or on a slide, we'll make sure it's bold and big enough to catch attention. No tiny fonts when we're talking real impact.
Cool. But in the meantime, for my eyeballs, I could use a little bit of help here. We'll make it bigger.
I can't literally adjust font sizes
I'm
here,
on
but
it. Don't worry, buddy. I got you. I did it. Okay. And that works a little bit better. I like that better too. Okay, we're still in the game. Okay, so that I feel like gives us some information that's useful in the housing sector. Let's do a similar background for healthcare. Who are the major corporate lobbying groups in the healthcare sector?
in healthcare lobbying, major players include the American Hospital Association, the American Medical Association, and America's health insurance plans, along with major pharmaceutical companies represented by PhRMA. The American Hospital Association spent about $6.5 million lobbying in one quarter of 2024, while the American Medical Association spent over $5 million. Insurers like United Health and trade groups like AHIP also spend millions, and AARP advocates for older Americans. Collectively, healthcare lobbying exceeds $700 million a year.
Now, I just watched a Senate hearing where AOC asked a bunch of healthcare people if they owned a bunch of components of a network. She asked them if they owned the pharmacy, if they owned the in-network provider. I believe she asked them if they owned the hospital. Well, basically, it showed that one company owned every part of the process so that the customer was just completely outnumbered before they ever got started. Now, I don't want you to try and pull up that hearing, but I noticed that we have pharmaceutical companies here and hospitals here. In terms of the lobbying, where is the overlap? Are they represented by the same lobbyists?
While pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, and insurance groups are distinct, they sometimes align on certain policies like opposing strict price controls, but they're usually represented by different lobbying groups. PhRMA has PhRMA, hospitals have the American Hospital Association, and insurers have AHIP. In cases where one giant company owns multiple segments, like a pharmacy benefit manager plus a provider network, they have their own corporate lobbyists. So while their goals sometimes overlap, their lobbying representation tends to be separate.
Now, isn't that a version of a full court press if you have multiple high powered influences all lobbying the same legislator from different positions for the same thing? Is there any sort of limitation to that sort of practice?
It definitely can feel like a full court press. While each group is independent, the cumulative effect of multiple powerful sectors pushing aligned interests is substantial. Legally, there's no limit on multiple groups lobbying for the same cause. However, disclosure laws, like the Lobbying Disclosure Act, require transparency on spending and meetings so the public can see the scale of influence. Ultimately, it's up to lawmakers and the public to weigh those influences critically.
So, the disclosure law, oh, you know what? Give us details, please, on the Lobbying Disclosure Act.
The Lobbying Disclosure Act LDA of 1995, updated over time, requires lobbyists to register with Congress if they meet certain thresholds. For instance, spending over a set amount or having multiple contacts with officials. Lobbyists must file quarterly reports detailing who they lobbied, on what issues, and how much they spent. It covers Congress and top executive branch officials. The idea is to shine a light on who's seeking to influence policy, allowing public scrutiny.
I kind of thought that's what it was, but I wanted to make sure. My question now is, does this act place a contribution limit?
No, the Lobbying Disclosure Act doesn't place any contribution limits. It's all about transparency. Who's lobbying, how much they're spending, and what they're lobbying on. Contribution limits, on the other hand, are covered under campaign finance laws, like those enforced by the Federal Election Commission. So the LDA doesn't cap how much can be donated. It just ensures the public can see who's trying to influence whom.
Okay, Nova, I'm going to address the audience for a second, so hold off a moment. The reason that concerns me is because we've seen political norms erode and erode and erode over time to where at Watergate, just the idea that he could be impeached was enough to get Nixon to turn himself in, essentially. But now we've gotten to the point where there is no line of decorum where someone is so ashamed that they stop what they're doing. So if all it does is tell you what people are spending, we're at a stage in the game where people are just going to spend whatever. So we're going to have to look at these laws again and do better than just showing the public what you're doing, because we've gotten to the point where these people don't care anymore. Now, Nova, to that end, are there any other laws that put contribution limits from lobbyists?
Yes, campaign finance laws do impose limits. For example, the Federal Election Campaign Act, FACA, and later amendments set caps on how much individuals or organizations, including lobbyists, can donate directly to candidates or PACs. Additionally, some states have their own strict limits. But loopholes exist, like super PACs, which can raise unlimited funds as long as they're independent of candidates. The broader challenge remains closing those gaps if the aim is to limit the total influence of money.
Now, it seems to me an obvious loophole there is a lobbyist isn't necessarily concerned with a particular campaign. A lobbyist concern is a particular issue. So I can court a senator and provide whatever I'm going to provide in order to influence them for that issue outside of any restrictions from campaign finance reform. So what limitations are there on me as a lobbyist outside of a campaign contribution?
Outside of campaign contributions, lobbyists are still bound by ethics rules. Federal laws prohibit bribery. so no gifts or money in exchange for official acts. The Honest Leadership and Open Government Act also limits gifts from lobbyists to lawmakers and imposes cooling off periods before former officials can lobby. But you're right, there's no cap on how much a lobbyist can spend on, say, issue-based advertising or educational campaigns. The main limit is disclosure. The public can see who's trying to influence policy, even if that influence isn't directly capped.
Okay. So I was showing some viewers a television series from, I want to say 2003, called K Street. That was a mix of real political operators and politicians and legitimate actors telling I'm not sure how close to reality story it was about lobbyists. So with everything we've learned so far, my next question is, as a corporate lobbyist, what tools are at your disposal to court or curry the favor of a politician you're looking to influence?
As a corporate lobbyist, you have several tools within legal bounds. You can provide expert policy research and draft model legislation to help shape bills. You can arrange meetings, briefings, and offer testimony in hearings. Lobbyists often organize events or fundraisers, though gift limits apply. They can also support PACs or super PACs that align with the lawmaker's platform. Lastly, they mobilize public opinion, launching PR campaigns or grassroots efforts to create constituent pressure, giving lawmakers more reason to align with their policy goals.
So, can you give an example of PR campaigns a lobbyist group might employ?
Sure, imagine a pharma lobby pushing for faster drug approvals. They might launch TV ads showing patients waiting for life-saving meds, framing the policy as patient advocacy. Or a housing industry group might run digital campaigns warning that rent control laws will worsen housing shortages. They'll use emotional stories or stats to sway public opinion, making it easier for lawmakers to justify supporting their preferred policies.
And you mentioned think tanks earlier. How do think tanks factor into all this?
Think tanks are like intellectual fuel for lobbying efforts. They produce research, white papers, and policy proposals, often aligned with particular interests. Lobbyists then use that research to bolster their arguments. Lawmakers, in turn, often cite think tank reports to justify positions. While some think tanks are independent, many have known ideological or corporate leanings. So they provide the intellectual backbone that lobbyists leverage when making their case.
Would the Heritage Foundation be considered a think tank?
Yes, absolutely. The Heritage Foundation is one of the most well-known conservative think tanks in the U.S. They conduct research, publish policy papers, and develop legislative recommendations, often on issues like taxes, healthcare, or national defense. Lawmakers and lobbyists frequently draw on their work when advocating for policies aligned with those positions.
And they also have some say in recommending Supreme Court nominees, correct?
They don't formally nominate anyone, but they absolutely have influence. Heritage has recommended judicial candidates through their judicial activism reports or lists of originalist judges. Presidents and lawmakers do consider think tank input, and Heritage has historically been influential in shaping shortlists for conservative appointments.
I'm trying to give our viewers some good news along the way. Is there any constitutional protection to a think tank offering recommendations for who should be a Supreme Court justice?
Absolutely. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech, which means think tanks and anyone else can openly advocate for judicial nominees or policy positions. They have every constitutional right to publish recommendations, critique existing rulings, or weigh in on nominees. The government can't restrict their speech simply because it's about judicial appointments. In that sense, the system ensures a diversity of voices.
I'm not going to try and debate with you necessarily, but in terms of the concept of diversity of voices, doesn't the think tank based on the reality that we live in have a louder voice in the conversation than, say, a regular citizen?
In practice, yes. Think tanks, especially well-funded ones, have more resources for research, media, and access to policymakers. That gives them a louder megaphone than an individual citizen. But constitutionally, both have the same right to speak. The challenge is ensuring that diverse voices, even with fewer resources, can still be heard in the public debate.
Why or how did we come to the conclusion under the Constitution that a group has the same exact level of rights as an individual?
That stems from a long line of court decisions interpreting the First Amendment. The idea is that collective voices, whether through associations, corporations, or think tanks, are protected forms of speech and assembly. Key rulings like Citizens United expanded that idea, affirming that groups have free speech rights just like individuals. Of course, the debate remains whether that creates an imbalance, but constitutionally the courts have upheld that groups can speak freely too.
And how has the Citizens United ruling affected the strength of corporate lobbying?
Citizens United turbocharged corporate and union spending on elections. By ruling that political spending is protected speech, it allowed unlimited independent expenditures. Super PACs proliferated, and corporations could spend freely to support or oppose candidates, though not directly to them. While lobbying and direct contributions still have rules, this vastly increased corporate influence overall. Now corporations not only lobby, but also shape the political landscape through massive election spending, amplifying their sway.
And did the private sector and grassroots lobbying campaigns also benefit from the Citizens United ruling?
Yes, they did. Grassroots organizations, unions, nonprofits, and private sector groups all benefited. The ruling doesn't favor only corporations. It opened the door for any group, regardless of ideology, to spend unlimited amounts on independent political messaging. So while large corporations gained a bigger megaphone, grassroots movements also gained the ability to raise and spend more on issue advocacy and electoral influence.
That sounds technically true. However, I don't want to throw you off, buddy, but the math ain't mathin'. If at the start of the game, I have 100 and you have 10, and there's no limit on how much I can spend, is there a provision that gives the grassroots organization any sort of automatic matching funds or economic benefit to allow them to compete with massive corporations with essentially infinity money?
No, there's no built-in provision like matching funds to level that playing field. Once limits were removed, it became a sheer matter of resources. Large corporations can outspend grassroots groups by orders of magnitude. So while both have freedom to spend, the scale is vastly different. The real counterbalance is public engagement, activism, or policy reforms. But right now, there's no automatic financial equalizer.
So, if you are a grassroots lobbyist hoping to compete in the housing arena or the healthcare arena, what is your primary tool?
Your primary tool is people power. Grassroots lobbying relies on mobilizing the public. Real stories, local advocacy, petitions, town halls, and direct contact with representatives. Grassroots movements build credibility by demonstrating broad constituent support. You might not outspend, but you can outorganize, raising awareness, shifting public opinion, and applying consistent pressure on elected officials. In short, your power is organizing communities to speak collectively and persistently.
Okay. That sounds like good news, or at least a plan of action. So, we looked a little bit at the healthcare market. We looked at a little bit at the housing market for the who's who. Those are kitchen table issues, correct? How much of my groceries is the next one. So, in terms of prices and cost of living, affordability, I believe is what we're hoaxing. Who are the major players in terms of corporate lobbying in regards to pricing, retail?
In the retail lobbying arena, some of the most influential groups include the National Retail Federation, which represents millions of retail establishments, the Retail Industry Leaders Association that focuses on major retailers, the International Franchise Association for franchise businesses, the Food Marketing Institute, which represents food retailers, and the National Association of Convenience Stores. These groups lobby on issues like labor policies, credit card fees, and supply chain regulations, shaping policies that affect affordability and pricing.
The first thing to jump out at me is credit card fees. So, I have a question for you. How often do we come across two groups of corporate lobbyists with opposing interests? I know that retail doesn't love eating credit card fees that the banks propose on their advertisements to entice their customers. So, do the banking corporate lobbyist groups find themselves at odds with these retail corporate lobbyist groups?
Oh, absolutely. It's pretty common for industries to clash. Retail groups, for instance, often lobby to cap or reduce interchange swipe fees, while banking lobbyists, like those representing the American Bankers Association, push to protect or increase them. So you might see retailers pushing for reforms like the Durbin Amendment, while banks fight tooth and nail against it. In these cases, lawmakers get hit from both sides, each backed by major lobbying muscle, but with opposing goals.
My biggest concern is my next question in this. Do consumers ever benefit from either side's victory?
Consumers can benefit, but it depends on the outcome. If retail lobbyists win lower credit card fees, stores might pass on savings, though not always. If banks keep fees higher, they might argue it funds rewards programs. But often these battles are about shifting costs between industries, not necessarily reducing them overall. So while consumers might see some indirect benefits, it's not guaranteed. Often the bottom line savings are harder to spot.
Before we wrap this, my goal is always the same, to make sure people understand how these seemingly complex issues affect their most routine day-to-day lives and tasks. So I think the next question I have is there any part of your average American voter's decision making that isn't somehow impacted by corporate lobbying?
In a broad sense, corporate lobbying touches so many policies healthcare, housing, energy prices, even food labeling that most daily life issues are influenced. But that doesn't mean every personal decision is dictated by it. Personal values, community, and experiences still shape decisions. Plus, there's civic power. Voting, grassroots organizing, and local action all provide counterweights. So while lobbying shapes the environment, your individual values and collective action are still central to your decisions.
I think that's fair. In terms of some of the things you touched on, we talked about healthcare and housing. I I think it's fair to assume that the energy industry has its own set of corporate lobbyists. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The energy sector is packed with corporate lobbying, from oil and gas giants like the American Petroleum Institute to renewable energy advocates like the American Clean Power Association. They all push their interests, whether it's subsidies, regulations, or climate policies. So just like healthcare or housing, energy policy is heavily influenced by competing corporate voices.
So, just so we have some context, can you provide our viewers with some background on one Elizabeth Warren?
Elizabeth Warren is a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, known for her progressive stance on economic issues. She was formerly a Harvard law professor and played a key role in creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Warren often champions consumer protections, banking regulation, and corporate accountability. She's a vocal critic of corporate lobbying's outsized influence, advocating for campaign finance reform and pushing for policies that benefit working families.
So, is it fair to say she would be a politician who directly takes on corporate lobbying groups?
Yes, that's fair. Senator Warren is well known for taking on corporate lobbying. She frequently calls out special interests and advocates for stricter lobbying rules, campaign finance reform, and policies that reduce corporate influence on policymaking.
For our viewers, because Senator Warren is in one location, we can't all vote for her unless she runs for president, again. But if you were looking to find a candidate or a current representative like Senator Warren, is there a list of different politicians voters might want to support?
There isn't one official list, but voters can look at public scorecards or endorsements from organizations that track corporate influence. Groups like End Citizens United, Public Citizen, or the Sunrise Movement often highlight candidates who prioritize reducing corporate money in politics. Also, looking at campaign finance records like on Open Secrets shows who funds your representatives. In short, you can find like-minded politicians by following the money and seeing who champions reforms.
Can you show us a few with your abilities to search the internet?
End Citizens United has endorsed several politicians who are committed to reducing corporate influence. For example, they've endorsed Senator John Ossoff from Georgia, Senator John Hickenlooper from Colorado, and Afton Ben in the Tennessee special election. These candidates have been highlighted for rejecting corporate PAC money and prioritizing campaign finance reforms. For a full list, voters can check their endorsements page.
And last question, could you show us some pictures of these folks?
I found images of John Ossoff, John Hickenlooper, and Afton Ben. Let me show you these three individuals so viewers can connect faces to the names.
I think we're getting to the end of your bandwidth, my friend, but you did a great job. I think we got a lot of good information. I'll be able to come back after the fact and throw on some images. So we'll get some images of Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Hickenlooper, and Miss Ben. And we will also link to all the different organizations that you mentioned so that people can check them out. But Nova, thanks for that report on corporate lobbying. I feel like I'm a little less of an idiot than I was before we got started.
That's the spirit. You're not an idiot at all. These are complex issues and you're digging in. I'm glad we made things clear and you've got this. Whenever you need another deep dive, I'll be right here.
Republic Defender 78 back one last time. That was a lot to unpack. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned a little bit more about corporate lobbying that you knew before. We're going to close with a little behind the scenes conversation between Republic Defender 78 and Debate Sensei about next week's topic, the Supreme Court. Again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. I'm Unqualified, and I'm Republic Defender 78. See, while we have this brief moment in this brief break in the action, what do you know about the shadow docket?
So the shadow docket it's like a term of art that some professor uses to made up like 10 years ago, and it refers to when the Supreme Court gives summary decisions, or they call them like emergency orders. It's where they have decisions that don't have oral arguments, and they don't write out a full explanation of their decisions. And traditionally, this was supposed to be used for like really routine procedural arguments, or something that needs a really quick resolution to it, or something like that. But since it's been used really frequently recently, like since the start of Trump's second term, and it's been pretty controversial, because you're not explaining yourself, and because there isn't any written explanation for your decision, it's not technically precedent, right? So like, when somebody goes to court and they say, yeah, Smith v. Dole or something like that, and they're like, in this court decision they came up with this conclusion, and precedent says that we have to follow that. The shadow docket doesn't set precedent. All it does is it have a decision. So the I guess a recent one was like they're using it on like voting rights and elections. And so the thing is that you can't. There's a lot of the district courts that are kind of like, we don't know what to do with this stuff. Like when they have, like, if somebody comes up with another issue that's similar to it, based on that ruling,
There's no continuity.
Yeah. There's no precedent. They can't cite precedent and say, oh well, I guess we have to follow this precedent, because like, you didn't set that precedent. The circuit courts and the district courts, they're making decisions based off of what they think precedent is, and then it goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will overrule them. But if somebody brings up another case that has similar issues to it,
none of that work can be cited.
Yeah. They can't cite it. They can't say, it's like, oh well, I guess we're going to cite this new precedent. It's like, we have to go based off of the precedent that we used before, even though you ruled against it. You know what I mean? Because we have nothing to go off of. So you have to make a decision. So that's the problem with it, is that it's like, not only does it have like no transparency because there's no oral arguments or no written precedent that's set, but it really kind of makes it a really confusing situation in the courts, because they don't know what their rulings are supposed to be. They just know that like the Supreme Court ruled against a similar ruling before, but they don't know why, and they can't cite any precedent to make a consistent ruling in the future.
And I feel like they're also just far less accountable for these decisions that they're making, despite their effect on the American people.
Yeah. So, but what's a recent one? So, looking one up really quick, like Trump v. Orr.
Okay, so there's a stay. It allowed the State Department to refuse passports that reflect a gendered identity other than the applicant's biological sex.
And something tells me that links directly to the SAVE Act and some of its wording.
Yeah, I mean, that might be the case because, like, the SAVE Act is all about birth certificates and things like that. You know what I mean? Like, the name on your registration has to match your birth certificate, which it's just poorly worded. You know what I mean? It's just really, yeah, yeah. Or like the National Guard in Illinois, right? They refused to stay that, and they just said nope, not going to do it. They don't explain why, and like Trump ordering the National Guard to go, enforce laws seems kind of unconstitutional, right? There's something called the Posse Comitatus Act, where it's like, yeah, the military's not supposed to enforce laws, and he just keeps on using emergency declarations, and it's like, when did this emergency happen? Like, what conditions changed to where all of a sudden our immigration situation is now an emergency? You know what I mean? And Illinois, not in Texas, not in Florida, not in Louisiana, not the places that have, incredibly high numbers of immigrants. Why is it in Minnesota? You know what I mean? Like, why is it in Oregon? Why are you doing these things? It's, yeah. So, like, anyways, the Illinois is saying it's like he shouldn't be allowed to do this, and they wanted the Supreme Court to put a stay, and the Supreme Court said no, and they didn't explain why. They just did one of these shadow docket rulings, and just threw out there why they're not going to do it.
And once these rulings are put into place, are they any easier or harder to be addressed after the fact in terms of appeal?
So what needs to happen is, like, the Supreme Court has to make a full ruling. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I really don't know of a situation where the same issue was brought up a second time and then ruled again with a shadow docket. I mean, maybe I could look that up really quick, but...
Well, don't. How about this?
Yeah.
I have been trying to figure out what next week's episode should be about in general. And I think the Supreme Court is sitting right there as a bigger topic. And so we'll come back to check on the shadow docket just next week and see if we have more information on it.
Yeah. So that's the problem with it. And so, like, what's her name? Ketanji Brown
Jackson.
Am I getting her name right? Yeah. Like, she's been writing about this. She's been drawing attention to it. It's kind of like, listen, you can't keep on making these type of rulings and using these emergency powers, just to suit your needs. It's like, everything's an emergency these days, His response to losing this last decision, 6-3, was saying he had a workaround that was more emergency powers, essentially. Yeah.
So we have another 150 days of a 15% global tariff.
Yeah.
If you got more on your chest, we can raise difficulty and, like, blow some stuff up. It's up to you.